In the quiet suburbs of Des Moines, Iowa, where neighbors still wave from their porches and everyone seems to know each other's dog by name, something happened in the fall of 2022 that no one saw coming. Margaret Lane, a 72-year-old retired school librarian known for her warm cookies and softer heart, filed a lawsuit against her only son. Yes, her son. The same boy she once stayed up with night after night through fevers and heartbreaks. To most, it felt unthinkable. To Margaret, it felt like the only choice left. Those who knew her couldn't understand what could have pushed a woman like Margaret to such a decision. Was it money? Betrayal? Or something deeper, a slow unraveling that had been years in the making? This isn't a story about courtroom drama. It's a story about love, trust, and the quiet cracks that can split even the strongest foundations. Margaret Lane had lived in the same modest brick house on Maple Street for over 40 years. After retiring from the local elementary school where she'd taught generations to love books, her days slowed to a peaceful rhythm, morning walks with her terrier, Daisy, coffee on the porch, and afternoons spent tending to her garden. Her life was quiet, predictable, and, in many ways, full. She saw her son, Daniel, at least once a week. He'd stop by after work to check in, fix whatever small thing needed fixing, and sometimes bring her groceries. He was a good son, everyone said. Divorced young, trying to get back on his feet. Margaret helped when she could, never keeping count. Neighbors often admired how close they were, mother and son. But sometimes when Margaret sat alone in the evenings, a flicker of doubt would pass through her mind like a cloud crossing the sun. Something she felt had started to shift. It started with a letter. Not an email, not a text, an actual envelope hand-delivered to Margaret's mailbox one chilly morning in early November. The return address was unfamiliar, a law office downtown. Curious, she opened it at the kitchen table, expecting perhaps a notice about taxes or insurance. But as her eyes scanned the neatly printed paragraphs, her hands began to tremble slightly. It was a formal request for financial documentation, specifically records of transfers she had made to her son over the past 3 years. Apparently, Daniel had listed her as a financial supporter in a court filing related to a pending business loan. Margaret hadn't known anything about a business loan. She folded the letter carefully, placing it back into the envelope as Daisy scratched at the back door. It wasn't alarming, not yet, but it left a quiet ache in her chest. Why hadn't Daniel mentioned any of this? And what exactly was he getting into? A week later, Margaret received a call from her bank. The young woman on the line was polite but firm. There had been an attempt to authorize a sizable withdrawal from Margaret's savings account. Nearly $18,000. The request had been flagged due to a signature mismatch. Margaret felt her stomach turn. She hadn't tried to withdraw anything. When she visited the bank in person the next morning, she was shown a copy of the withdrawal form. The handwriting looked eerily like hers, but just off. And the signature, it was her name, but it wasn't her hand. She sat there for a long moment, her palms cold against the desk, trying to make sense of it. The banker asked if she had given anyone else access to her account. Margaret hesitated, then quietly said, "My son has the second key to my safe." She left the bank that day with a knot of worry she couldn't untie. 2 days before Thanksgiving, Margaret received a voicemail from an unfamiliar number. It was from an attorney named Claire Jensen, politely requesting a call back regarding a matter involving Ms. Lane's notarized property documents. Confused and uneasy, Margaret returned the call. Claire explained that Daniel had recently submitted papers transferring co-ownership of Margaret's house to his name, documents that appeared to bear her signature and a notary stamp. Margaret felt the room tilt. She had never signed such papers, let alone in front of a notary. That evening, she pulled out her old filing box, every paper neatly organized from decades of careful living, and began comparing signatures going back years. The difference was subtle, but it was there. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to ask a painful question: had Daniel forged her name? It wasn't just a mistake or misunderstanding anymore. It was something bigger, and she knew she couldn't ignore it. The Monday after Thanksgiving, Margaret met with Claire Jensen in person. Sitting across from the younger woman in a modest downtown office, Margaret was shown copies of multiple documents, bank authorizations, a home equity loan application, and even a drafted will, all bearing her name. Some had dates she remembered being home with the flu or away visiting her sister. Claire looked at her gently and asked, "Are you absolutely certain you didn't sign these?" Margaret could only nod, stunned. It wasn't just one forgery, it was a pattern. Her son had been building a quiet paper trail, gradually positioning himself to take legal control of her finances, her home, and eventually her estate. The betrayal hit like a physical weight. Fear, yes, but deeper than that was sorrow. A dull, consuming ache. She had trusted Daniel without question, helped him whenever he asked, and now it seemed he had used that trust like a tool, or a weapon. She left the office in silence, her heart pounding with the burden of what she now knew. Margaret sat alone at her kitchen table, the legal documents spread out in front of her, her hands trembling as she reread the names, her name on each one. She had trusted her son more than anyone, and now here she was, contemplating filing a lawsuit against him. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. If she moved forward, there would be no going back. Daniel would know, and he would be furious. The idea of standing in a courtroom, facing her own flesh and blood, made her stomach twist in knots. But Margaret also knew she couldn't just let it slide. This wasn't about money or possessions. It was about her dignity, her security, and the trust that had been shattered. Could she really do this to her son? Could she betray him as he had betrayed her? She stood, the question hanging in the air. What will I do now? Margaret spent the next few days in a fog, consumed by doubt. Her mind raced between anger and grief, replaying every conversation, every moment with Daniel, trying to find a clue she had missed. She felt trapped in a maze of betrayal and confusion. The thought of losing him forever, of the irreparable damage this could cause, crushed her. Her heart ached, but so did her sense of justice. On the day she was supposed to meet her lawyer to finalize the papers, Margaret hesitated outside the door. She felt as though her whole life had been upended, her family, her future, her sense of security. And yet, as she stood there, something in her stirred. Not hope, not yet, but a sense of clarity. This was her decision to make, and though the road ahead seemed painful and uncertain, she was no longer willing to live in fear. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. Margaret didn't speak to Daniel for nearly a month after the lawyer's meeting. She spent those weeks slowly building her strength, sorting through her emotions, and weighing her options. The decision wasn't easy, but she knew what had to be done. She contacted Claire again, this time to finalize the legal proceedings. The lawsuit was filed, but Margaret didn't do it out of spite. She did it to protect herself, to stand firm against what had been done in the shadows. A week later, Daniel came to her house. He stood in the doorway, his face tired, eyes red. "Mom, we need to talk," he said quietly. Margaret took a deep breath. It wasn't the confrontation she had imagined. There were no angry words, no shouting. Instead, she simply said, "I'm taking back control of my life, Daniel. I hope one day you understand why." It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning. She was free, finally, truly free. Months passed, and while things with Daniel remained strained, Margaret found a quiet peace she hadn't known in years. She continued to live in her home, tending to her garden, and even took a few small trips, something she hadn't done since her husband passed. The legal battle had taken its toll, but she was stronger now, more resolute. Her relationship with Daniel hadn't healed completely, but it wasn't as bitter as she feared. They spoke occasionally, sometimes about trivial things, other times about the past. Margaret realized that some wounds might never fully close, but she had given herself the chance to rebuild. Looking out her window one evening, Margaret wondered, how far would you go to protect yourself? Even if it meant losing someone you love? She still didn't have an answer, but one thing was clear. Sometimes the hardest thing is knowing when to stand up for yourself. What about you? Have you ever faced a situation where you had to choose between love and your own well-being?